As we continue our thoughts with regard to Brother Holland, we want to maybe spend some time and talk about preaching salvation, because Brother Holland had the ability to preach Christ and Him crucified. And I know he did a series on salvation, Paul.
In fact, it was out at the Diana Church to begin with, one of those during the Diana Singing Week in June, when they would start a meeting on Sunday and go through Thursday night, and then the singing would be Friday and Saturday. And Brother Tom told me what he was going to do that year, and he was going to talk about salvation. Well, the first knee-jerk reaction of mine I had was, well, we talk about salvation a lot. He said, no, I'm going to take reconciliation, redemption, sanctification, justification, forgiveness, and then a general theme for the 6 lessons. I went out and heard a good portion of those lessons at the Diana Church in that June year. And I went to him after the first lesson, and I told him, I was eyeball to eyeball, I said, Brother Tom, this does not just need to be here. We need to videotape it. So he came to the studio, we videotaped each of the lessons. It's now available on DVD. But every one of those lessons, you can only imagine, as the great mind that he had, and Jimmy, you've been the privileged recipient of some of the studies with him, as he would look at that word and go back and maybe exhaust as far as what redemption meant under the old law, what it meant under the new law, what it means for us today, just to use that as an example.
Right. Well, he had the ability to look at topics like that and I think make a lot of application to people. You were talking about the different subjects. I know many years ago when we had GBN at the Ryman, he preached on reconciliation. And it was a masterpiece of a lesson. Matter of fact, I went back and listened to that lesson again just recently, and what a masterpiece it was. Brother Holland believed, he understood the power of sin and the end result of a life lived in sin and the redemptive power of God. And he preached that. His life was spent preaching salvation, wasn't it?
Correct, yeah. He pressed also the concept of the grace of God and the love of God, where some might go to the point of saying, okay, you're not preaching enough on grace, or you're not preaching enough on the love of God, as though we in Churches of Christ don't believe in the grace of God and the love of God. And that wasn't the case, and that's not the case. That's right. Because over and over and over, he would impress upon us as preacher students, and then later on in our preaching as he would listen. I mean, I can remember a lectureship I was on, and he's seated in the audience, and I'm doing the speaking. And when it was over, he would come up to me, and he mentioned one particular time. He says, I want to let you know that you helped me tonight. And I thought, what did I say to help you? You know, here I am the student, and here you are the teacher, but now I'm just a preacher and you're a preacher as far as the work that I was doing, the work that he was doing. But the idea, if you preach the truth, nobody appreciated that more than he did.
That's right.
Okay, and he let you know that he appreciated it. Okay, and he was also honest enough to know that if there was something that he disagreed with you about, you know, as Paul was mentioning, truth and love, he would let you know that. Yes, he did not want you to take any step away from what Jesus has provided through the cross and through the resurrection. And when you did that, you had no one who stood in your corner with you. Should anybody criticize you about that, he would stand with you. And for a preacher sometimes who has to take a tough stand on some things, and sometimes you get criticized by your own brethren sometimes, but when someone says, you preach the truth, God's pleased with you and God's people are pleased with you. And when you've got those people to rally around you, I'm not saying preaching's easy. I'm not saying living the Christian life is easy. Right. But what it is it makes it a lot easier to be able to take the stand that you have to take. And that's one thing about Brother Holland, and in many ways a lot of the teachers like him when I was at Freed-Hardeman. Mm-hmm. And even beyond that, as my circle of preachers began to grow in the work of a preacher, not just a preacher's kid, but as a preacher, you seek out ultimately the people that are going to support what it is that you're going to stand for. And the one thing I've always appreciated by Brother Holland, Brother Woodson, and so many others is when you preach the truth, okay, they may even give you an additional point or thought that you didn't bring out in the sermon, or maybe you hadn't thought of it in a long time, and then you can incorporate that point that they shared with you into a future sermon. It made your sermons better. It made a future point in your sermons better. And he was a master at being able to listen to preacher sermons and saying, have you thought about this particular point? And the next, like justification, redemption, sanctification, reconciliation, all the synonyms that have to do with the salvation of man in the Bible. And,
you know, you triggered a thought. You were mentioning the fact that he came to you after one of your lectures. I heard him say at the Ryman, if I'm not mistaken, he quoted the old song, the stanza, I love to tell the story to those who know it best. And then he added this, he said, but I also love to hear the story.
Right.
And I think that's so true. You mentioned something about him preaching the grace of God, the mercy of God, the love of God.
Right.
I know that we went through a period where some were caricaturing preachers of the past as people not preaching grace and mercy and love, etc. And I remember Brother Holland, if I recall correctly, coming to the defense of some of the pioneer preachers and saying, hey, wait a minute, these guys did preach on those subjects.
Oh, yes.
And they certainly did. Jimmy, you mentioned also how that he would come and sometimes not so much just correct, but enhance further a subject. I was thinking even as you were talking, but he did it like Aquila and Priscilla.
Oh, yeah.
He would never do it,
you
know, publicly and humiliating or something of that. I received one of those times when he kind of talked to me privately a little bit later, and he said, "You didn't say it wrong," but he said this might be a better way to say it.
Right.
Just a tender way of helping everyone that he came in contact with.
And you know what? Don't you think because he loved you as a person
Absolutely.
and as a brother,
Right.
he felt like he could say that and not hurt you, but help you?
Let me make a comment about appreciating Brother Holland as a teacher, particularly homiletic teacher at Freed-Hardeman. I knew that Tom Holland had done located work as a preacher before he ever became a teacher at Freed-Hardeman. So I knew he'd been in the trenches. And my dad being a preacher and my being a preacher's child, I knew that life as a preacher's child. Now, not as a preacher per se, but as a preacher's child. So, sitting at the feet of an individual who was a located preacher, had done located work before, and now he's going to teach you how located work works. He didn't just teach preparation and delivery of sermon, he taught preacher and his work. And I remember sitting in class one day and preacher and his work, and Brother Holland was mentioning things that sometimes the brotherhood would require of you as a preacher that we would say are not written in the contract, so to speak. And there were fellow students of mine sitting around and they weren't paying attention. Well, he was talking about things that I knew my dad had done before. As though, you know, well, let's not get a sermon in a Bible class and write a bulletin article and that's what you're going to be doing 7 days out of a week. You're going to be doing this and this and this. And these guys are sort of shaking their head. Well, I'm not going to do that. And I'm like, listen, you better pay attention to what he's saying. This is exactly what you're going to do. He knew from having done local work that I need to let you know so that to be forewarned is to be forearmed. And he, in that class, and that's what I appreciated. You can have a teacher who has the training in school, even the doctorate training, but if they haven't literally done what you're about to do, while you're telling me things that I need to know, it's different from a person who's been there.
That's right.
And now you're an instructor to teach a person who is about to be there. That was the power that you sensed when he taught and when he preached. And then the sermons he would preach, it's like, I get that. I've got to preach that kind of sermon.
That's right.
And I've got to preach those verses in the power in which he's mentioning it. It wasn't soft-spoken, it wasn't unkind, but it was plain to where when you walked out of there, you did not misunderstand what he was saying.
Right. That's right.
And that's the kind of preaching our people, I think, want still. There is, I believe, a hunger out there for people that just want the Bible. They're tired of the huff and the fluff. They're tired of I'm okay, you're okay, because they look around at the world and realize things aren't okay. And there's only one hope we're ever going to have. Now that's where Tom Holland filled that need.
That's right.
That's where
right.
he knew that if it's not the salvation of your soul and the salvation of those around you, then what else is out there in this world? And the Bible was the only light. And that's what he picked up. And he pressed that over and over and over. And for some folks it stuck, for some folks it needs to stick, to be honest with you.
Absolutely. Amen.
So,
Mike, there's one more thought that just occurred to me. Last year, Tom was weak physically, but he called and he said, I would like to speak at PTP. In those 3 lessons that he videotaped and we showed there, he talked about salvation of all people. He emphasized the fact that he knew that his time was short, but he wanted to go to heaven with all of you, he said.
How about that?
Powerful.
That's powerful stuff. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back and talk about Tom's Pastime Porch. Appreciate you guys so much for your thoughts and memories of Tom Holland.